Ancient Roman wine fueled legions and inspired emperors, but its true taste has been lost for centuries. We are going to change that by physically testing their forgotten recipes. By the end of this journey, you will know exactly what a glass of 2,000-year-old wine might have tasted like. We will investigate why they used lead pots despite the danger, and whether their sweet, spiced wines would please a modern palate. What is the one flavor from the past you would most want to experience yourself? Ancient Romans believed a great wine was born in the soil, long before it ever reached the amphora. Our quest to recreate their vintage starts with this fundamental truth. In the very dirt of the vineyard, the Romans were not casual about their grapes. Writers like Pliny the Elder meticulously documented the varieties they prized most highly, singling out types like the thick-skinned Armenian and the robust Nomentan for their exceptional quality and character. These were the grapes that built a reputation. So how do we find them today? Those specific ancient vines are largely extinct, lost to time and changing climates. Our modern equivalent involves a deep dive into the world of Italian heirloom varieties, seeking out grapes that share those same key traits of high tannin levels and intense flavor profiles, perhaps a Sagrantino or a Montepulciano, to stand in for their legendary ancestors. But the grape itself is only half the story. The Romans had a profound understanding of what we now call terroir, that magical combination of soil, climate, and landscape that gives a wine its unique voice. They insisted on planting their vineyards on sunny, south-facing slopes. This was not a mere preference, it was a calculated strategy. A south-facing slope captures the maximum amount of sunlight, bathing the grapes in warmth from dawn until dusk. This extra heat ripens the fruit more completely, concentrating its sugars and developing complex flavors that grapes grown in flatter, shadier fields could never achieve. It was the first and most critical step in a long process, a deliberate choice to capture the sun itself within every single berry. Without this perfect raw ingredient, any wine we made would be a hollow imitation. The true flavor of Rome was forged here, on these sun-drenched hillsides. With the sun captured in the grapes, our attention turns to the tools that would transform that raw potential into liquid history. Before we crush a single grape, we need to assemble the Roman winemaker's essential kit. The process began in the lacus vinarius, the primary fermentation vat. This was not a simple bucket. It was a wide, shallow vessel, often made from wood, designed to give the grape maximum contact with the air. This exposure was crucial for initiating the wild fermentation driven by the natural yeasts living on the grape skins themselves. The material of the vat, whether wood or porous terracotta clay, would have subtly interacted with the fermenting juice, potentially contributing its own microscopic flora to the process. After the initial ferment, the young wine was transferred to the dolium. These were massive, egg-shaped storage jars, sometimes taller than a person, which were buried up to their necks in the ground. This burial provided a naturally cool and stable temperature, a primitive but effective climate control system that allowed the wine to mature slowly and develop complexity over many months, or even years. But to get the juice into these vessels, you first had to extract it from the fruit. For that, the Romans relied on the torcularium, a sophisticated wooden screw press. This device applied immense, controlled pressure to the grape pulp, squeezing out every last precious drop. The design was so effective that its basic principles are still used in some wineries today. Now, we must address the most controversial material in their toolkit, lead. The Romans used lead pipes to transport water and lead pots to boil and reduce grape must into a sweet syrup called defrutum. We know now that lead is a potent neurotoxin, so for our safe modern recreation, we will substitute a stainless steel pot for this heating step. This choice allows us to replicate the chemical process of caramelizing the sugars without introducing a deadly element. Each piece of this equipment, from the porous clay of the dolium to the crushing force of the press, would have left its own distinct fingerprint on the wine's final character, influencing everything from its clarity and tannin structure to its oxidative notes. The stage is now set. We have our sun-drenched fruit and our authentic yet safe Roman toolkit. The real magic and the greatest mystery is about to begin inside those vats. The moment of harvest was a high-stakes decision for a Roman winemaker, a delicate balance between nature's pace and human need. They did not simply pick grapes when they looked ripe. They waited for a precise signal from the vine itself. The agricultural writer Columella left us detailed notes, instructing farmers to watch for a specific change in the grape stems. When the stems themselves turned from a vibrant green to a purplish brown, it was a sign that the vine had transferred its full energy into the fruit. This was the green light, but visual cues were only part of the story. The most important test was conducted by taste. A winemaker would walk the rows, plucking grapes from different parts of the vineyard, crushing them in his mouth to judge the balance of sweetness against acidity. He was not just looking for sugar, he was searching for the foundation of a wine that could both please the palate and stand the test of time. Too early a harvest, and the wine would be thin and sour. Too late, and it could become flabby, lacking the structure to age. Following these ancient instructions, we would do the same, letting the taste of the grape itself guide our hands. The actual harvest was a monumental, labor-intensive event. Entire families and every available worker would descend upon the vineyard at dawn, armed with curved knives. They worked quickly, slicing the heavy clusters and placing them gently into wide, shallow baskets to avoid bruising the precious fruit. This was back-breaking work, and it was surrounded by a cloud of superstition. Pliny the Elder warns that a menstruating woman who walked through a vineyard could curse the entire crop, causing it to wither on the vine. Workers might offer silent prayers to Bacchus, the god of wine, hoping to secure his favor for a bountiful and successful fermentation. Every aspect, from the timing to the tools to the rituals, was designed to capture a perfect moment of ripeness. With the harvest complete and the baskets overflowing, we face the most transformative step of all, the brutal, beautiful act of crushing. The rhythmic stomp of bare feet in a vat of grapes is one of the most enduring images of ancient winemaking, a scene that feels both primitive and strangely joyful. We replicated this iconic act, stepping into a shallow wooden lacus filled with our freshly harvested clusters. The initial sensation is a surprising burst of coolness, followed by the slick, smooth texture of grape skins giving way underfoot. This was far from a solitary chore. It was a social event, a moment of shared labor that often erupted into spontaneous celebration, with music and laughter echoing through the winery. But the Romans were not just being festive, they were employing a brilliantly gentle technology. The human foot applies just the right amount of pressure to burst the grapes and release the free-run juice, while being soft enough to avoid crushing the bitter seeds and stems nestled within the pulp. This careful extraction meant the first and finest quality must. The juice that would become the best wine was spared the harsh tannins that could make it unpalatably astringent. We collected this foot-trodden must, a strikingly deep purple liquid, cloudy with pulp and vibrant with fresh, fruity aromas. For comparison, we then ran another batch of grapes through the wooden screw press, the torcularium. The mechanical press exerted immense force, squeezing the pulp and seeds to yield a much larger volume of juice. The visual difference was immediate. The press juice was darker, almost opaque, and you could already sense a more robust, slightly rougher character on the nose. The Romans understood this distinction perfectly. They segregated the juices. The pristine, free-run juice from the feet was reserved for the finest wines, destined for the tables of the elite, while the press wine, with its more aggressive profile, was often used for lesser blends or even the vinegar posca drank by soldiers and slaves. This single step, the crush, already determined the destiny of the wine, separating the liquid aristocracy from the common drink long before it ever touched an amphora. The gentle crush of feet could only release so much of the grape's hidden treasure. To truly conquer the harvest, the Romans deployed a machine of brilliant force, the screw press. We rebuilt one based on the designs of Heron of Alexandria, a towering wooden frame that creaked with potential. The leftover pulp from our treading, a dense mass of skins and seeds called the marc, was carefully gathered into sturdy cloth bags. These bags were stacked like bricks within the press, a neat pile waiting for the final squeeze. Turning the long wooden lever was a test of pure strength, a slow, groaning effort that made the timbers shudder. You could hear the wood strain as immense pressure built, forcing a dark, ruby stream to trickle, then flow from the compressed pulp. This was not the same juice we captured with our feet. The first pressing, what the Romans called mustum primarium, was still a wine of decent quality, robust and deeply colored. But the true test of their frugality came with the second, and even third, pressings. We kept these runs separate, watching the liquid change with each turn of the screw. The mustum sequens, the following must, was progressively thinner, cloudier, and far more astringent. Its flavor dominated by the harsh tannins ripped from the crushed seeds and stems. A Roman winemaker saw not waste, but hierarchy in these different liquids. The pristine free-run juice and the fine first press might be blended to create a wine for a senator's table. The rougher second pressing could become an everyday drink for the household. And the final, most aggressive pressings, thin and sharp, were often left to sour, destined to become posca, the vinegar water that fortified Roman legions on the march. In that single press, we saw the entire social order of Rome reflected in the quality of the juice, a stark reminder that every drop had its designated place. That freshly pressed must, vibrant and full of potential, now faced its greatest transformation. It was time to initiate the wild fermentation, a process the Romans guided not with packaged yeast, but with the invisible native microbes living on the grape skins themselves. We poured the same juice into two very different vessels to see how the container itself would shape the wine's soul. The first was a modern glass carboy, a transparent and inert environment that gives a winemaker complete control. The second was a replica dolium, a massive egg-shaped terracotta jar, its unglazed interior porous and alive with possibility. Following Roman practice, we buried this dolium up to its neck in the earth. The difference between the two was not just material, it was philosophical. The glass carboy acted as a sterile bubble, isolating the fermenting juice from the outside world. You could watch the furious activity inside, a churning storm of bubbles rising through the deep purple liquid, but it was a closed system. The buried dolium, however, became part of the vineyard's ecosystem. The earth around it provided a natural insulation. maintaining a cool, steady temperature that protected the delicate fermentation from the swings of daytime heat and nighttime chill. This temperature stability was a hidden advantage, preventing the yeast from becoming too stressed and producing harsh off flavors. But the dolium's magic went deeper than temperature control. Its porous clay walls allowed for a whisper-thin exchange of gases. Tiny amounts of oxygen could slowly seep into the wine, a process modern winemakers call micro-oxygenation. This gentle, continuous exposure does something remarkable. It softens the wine's harsher edges, encouraging the tannins to polymerize or link together, which makes them feel smoother and less abrasive on your palate. Over many months, this slow breath of air helps the wine develop a more complex and rounded character, evolving from a simple, fruity juice into a beverage with layers of aroma and flavor. We watched as the fermentation in the glass carboy raced ahead, a frantic and vigorous process. Inside the dolium, the fermentation was slower, more deliberate, a quiet and steady work happening in the cool, dark earth. The Romans, without understanding the science of oxygen molecules, had perfected a vessel that naturally nurtured their wine to a more graceful maturity. The container was not just a holding tank. It was an active participant in the wine's story, and we were about to taste the proof of its influence. The fermentation in our dolium was a testament to the power of wild, unseen forces. But it raises a fundamental question, one that divides historians and winemakers to this day. Did the Romans simply trust the air to provide the yeast for their wine, or did they take a more active role in guiding the process? To solve this, we set up a direct competition between chance and control. In one vessel, we relied solely on the wild, ambient yeast floating in the air of our vineyard, the same invisible cloud that would have settled on Roman grapes. In a second, identical vessel, we introduced a cultivated pitch. This was not a modern laboratory strain, but something a Roman winemaker could have easily created, a starter made from the dried skins of a previous successful harvest, teeming with a known and proven community of yeast cells. The difference between the two fermentations was stark and immediate. The wild batch began slowly, almost hesitantly. For days, the surface of the must remained still, a quiet waiting game where any number of microscopic organisms could have been vying for dominance. We knew the risks all too well. A wild fermentation is a gamble, a microscopic battlefield where desirable yeast could be outcompeted by spoilage bacteria, turning the precious wine to vinegar before it ever had a chance. The batch with the added pitch, however, sprang to life with a confident vigor. Bubbles rose in a steady, energetic stream within hours, a clear sign that a strong, established population had taken command of the vat. This controlled start offered a huge advantage, dramatically reducing the chance of a spoiled batch and creating a more predictable, reliable result. But predictability is not always the same as quality. As the fermentations progressed, we began to smell their distinct personalities emerging. The pitched wine was clean and fruity, a straightforward expression of the grape. The wild fermentation, however, was a more complex and unpredictable symphony. Its aromas were layered with subtle, earthy notes, a hint of spice, and a unique character that could only come from a diverse ecosystem of native yeast. This was the true heart of the mystery. A Roman winemaker, using a pitch from a family amphora passed down through generations, might have been cultivating a unique house yeast, a living fingerprint that gave their wine a consistent and recognizable flavor year after year. But another, perhaps in a new region or after a poor harvest, might have had no choice but to trust the wild air, accepting both the risk of failure and the potential for a truly unique, one-of-a-kind vintage. The choice between a wild ferment and a cultivated pitch was not just a technical decision. It was a question of philosophy, a balance between the safety of tradition and the thrilling uncertainty of nature's own hand. And this was only the beginning of the transformation, because the Romans had another, far more controversial ingredient to add to the mix. The choice between wild yeast and a controlled pitch was a gamble on the wine's fundamental character, but the Roman winemakers' true artistry came after the fermentation settled. They were not passive observers, they were master blenders, treating each vessel of wine as a single note in a grander symphony. Ancient texts are filled with recipes that read like culinary formulas, detailing how to mix wines from different regions, various grape varieties, or even separate vintages to achieve a perfect, balanced whole. A sharp, acidic wine from a cool northern slope could be tempered by blending it with a sweeter, more robust wine from a sun-drenched southern vineyard. This was not merely dilution, it was correction and enhancement. We decided to put this ancient practice to the test, creating several single varietal wines with intentionally exaggerated profiles. One was fiercely tannic and astringent, another was flabby and overly soft, and a third possessed a simple, one-dimensional fruitiness. Our challenge was to use only these components, following the Roman philosophy, to create something greater than the sum of its parts. We started with the simplest correction, marrying a portion of the harsh, tannic wine with the soft, low-acid one. The transformation was immediate and remarkable. The aggressive bite of the first wine was tamed by the roundness of the second, while the structure of the tannins gave a needed backbone to the otherwise limp liquid. It was no longer two flawed wines, but a single, harmonious beverage. Then we explored complexity. Historical accounts praise wines like the famous Kikubin for their distinctive smoky character. While we could not replicate that exact lost flavor, we created an analog by toasting some grape wood and introducing its essence to a small batch of wine, giving it a distinct, savory note. We then used this smoky wine not as a main course, but as a seasoning, adding just a tiny amount, perhaps 1 part in 20, to a blend of our other wines. The effect was profound. That minuscule addition did not make the blend taste smoky. Instead, it added a layer of intrigue in the finish, a subtle complexity that made the wine linger on the palate in a more interesting way. This was the secret to a signature house style. A Roman merchant could create a recognizable and sought-after product by consistently using a small amount of a distinctive local wine in all his blends, building a reputation on a whisper of smoke, a hint of spice, or a memory of the sea. Their goal was not to showcase a single, pure expression of a grape, but to engineer a consistent and pleasurable drinking experience, batch after batch, year after year. The final taste of Rome was not born in a single vineyard, but in the mixing room, where science met art in the bottom of a clay cup. Our exploration of Roman blending reveals a culture obsessed with engineering the perfect drink, yet their most defining ingredient was not another wine, but a syrup. The secret to that characteristic Roman sweetness and longevity was defrutum, or its even more concentrated cousin, sapa. This was not merely a sweetener, it was a preservative and a flavoring agent all in one, created by boiling fresh grape must in a relentless reduction until it transformed into a thick, dark syrup. We set out to recreate this process exactly as described in the ancient texts, but with one critical modern safeguard for the batch we would actually taste. Historical sources clearly indicate that lead pots were a preferred vessel for this boiling, because the metal was easy to work with and conducted heat efficiently. We know now, of course, that this practice leached a potent neurotox and directly into the food supply. To understand the historical method without the poison, we prepared two separate batches. One syrup was boiled in a replica lead-lined bronze pot, destined only for chemical analysis. The other, identical in every other way, was reduced in a perfectly safe stainless steel pot. This allowed us to separate the folklore from the factual chemistry, to understand what the Romans were truly adding to their wine. Watching the transformation was a lesson in patience and fire. We started with gallons of fresh, frothy must, pouring it into the pots over a steady flame. For hours, we watched it bubble and thicken, the volume shrinking relentlessly. The air filled with the incredible aroma of caramelizing sugar and cooked fruit, a scent halfway between modern maple syrup and a rich fruit jam. The color deepened from a translucent purple to a viscous, opaque blackish brown. By the time it was reduced to 1/3 of its original volume for defrutum, or a staggering 1/3 for sapa, it had the consistency of molasses. We carefully sampled the safe version, and the flavor was a shock to the modern palate. This was not a simple, clean sweetness like honey or sugar. It was a powerful, almost savory concentration of dried figs, prunes, and a distinct tang of acidity, all underpinned by a bitter note from the caramelized sugars. Adding just a small amount of this syrup to a neutral wine was a revelation. It did more than sweeten, it fundamentally altered the wine's body, giving it a heavier, almost oily texture that coated the glass. The color intensified to a deep garnet, and the aroma gained layers of stewed fruit and that distinctive cooked character. The wine became something entirely different, something richer, more potent, and undeniably Roman. This was the flavor of preservation, a way to stabilize a volatile beverage for long sea voyages and storage in dusty amphorae. But our parallel experiment with the lead pot revealed the horrifying cost of that flavor. Laboratory analysis of that syrup showed significantly elevated levels of lead acetate, a compound famously known as sugar of lead for its deceptively sweet taste. This toxin would have accumulated in the bodies of those who regularly consumed wine treated this way, leading to gout, severe abdominal pain, infertility, and mental decline. The Roman aristocracy, who drank the most of this finest, sweetened wine, were slowly poisoning themselves with every glass. Their pursuit of the perfect, stable vintage came with a devastating price, one they could not have understood, but one we can now measure with chilling precision. The legacy of defrutum is a bittersweet paradox, a testament to their culinary ingenuity shadowed by a tragic ignorance. The Romans saw air not as an enemy to their wine, but as a vital collaborator in its aging. This deliberate exposure stands in stark contrast to our modern obsession with airtight seals, and to understand their logic, we had to let our wine breathe. We divided a finished batch into two different aging vessels. The first was a sealed glass demijohn, a container designed to lock out the outside world completely. The second was a replica terracotta amphora, a vinum fictile, left with a simple cloth and loose clay lid that allowed a slow, steady exchange of air. We placed both in a cool, dark cellar, mimicking the conditions of a Roman storage vault, and then we waited. For weeks, nothing seemed to happen, but as the months passed, the two wines began to walk down diverging paths. The wine in the sealed glass remained static, its bright, fruity character preserved but largely unchanged. It was safe, but it was not evolving. The wine in the porous amphora, however, was undergoing a quiet transformation. The terracotta itself acted like a lung, its unglazed walls permitting a whisper-thin, continuous flow of oxygen. This gentle oxidation began to work its magic on the wine's chemistry. When we finally sampled them, the difference was a lesson in ancient wisdom. The sealed wine was simple and direct, a straightforward taste of the grape. The amphora-aged wine was something else entirely. Its color had softened from a deep purple to a brick-red garnet. On the nose, the primary fruit notes had receded, replaced by a complex bouquet of dried figs, roasted nuts, and a distinct savory hint that reminded us of fine sherry or aged Madeira. This was the taste of controlled oxidation, a flavor profile the Romans would have recognized instantly. This practice was not an accident. It was a calculated strategy for stability. A wine that had already been gently oxidized in the amphora was far less likely to spoil from a sudden shock of air during a turbulent sea voyage in a porous clay jar. By pre-aging their wines in this way, Roman merchants were essentially vaccinating them against the rigors of travel, creating a product that was robust, complex, and capable of surviving for years. The nutty, sherry-like notes we detected were not flaws, but the signature of a wine engineered for endurance. This was the final, crucial step in the process, a patient collaboration with the air itself that turned a simple fermented drink into a lasting testament to Roman ingenuity. Our journey into the heart of Roman flavor now leads us into the spice cabinet, a realm where practicality and pure eccentricity collide. The Romans did not just drink plain wine, they seasoned it with a wild array of herbs, spices, and even stranger ingredients, transforming it into a kind of aromatic cocktail. We set up a miniature laboratory of antiquity, creating a series of small test batches to explore these ancient recipes firsthand. Following the notes of writers like Pliny the Elder, we infused our base wine with a selection of their most documented additives. One jar received a generous bundle of fresh thyme, another a few precious threads of saffron, and a third a handful of fragrant rose petals. Then we ventured into the more challenging territory, preparing one batch with a splash of filtered seawater and another with a lump of pine pitch, the same resin used to seal the interiors of amphorae. The aromatic transformation began almost instantly. The thyme-infused wine developed a savory, almost medicinal character, its herbal notes rising from the glass like a walk through a sun-baked Mediterranean hillside. The saffron batch turned a brilliant golden yellow and offered a distinctly exotic, floral aroma, a luxury meant for the wealthiest tables. The rose petal wine was surprisingly delicate, its perfume subtle and floral, a drink that felt more like a fragrant gesture than a bold statement. These were the pleasant, understandable experiments. The other two, however, presented a far greater challenge to the modern palate. The seawater wine was immediately briny and sharp, the salt amplifying the wine's acidity in a way that was bracing, to say the least. It was easy to see how this could have been a practical way to replenish electrolytes for soldiers or laborers, but as a pleasurable drink, it was a stark, acquired taste. Then came the pitch. The resin imparted a pungent, piney aroma that was overwhelmingly chemical at first sniff. The flavor was aggressively bitter and left a lingering turpentine-like note on the tongue. This was the true divider, the ingredient that separates our modern sensibilities from the Roman world. For them, the pitch was likely a familiar, even expected note, a flavor born from the very vessel the wine was stored in, and it may have served to mask the taste of a wine that was beginning to turn. Tasting these experimental batches was like deciphering a lost culinary language. It reveals a culture that viewed wine not as a pure expression of fruit, but as a blank canvas, a base liquid to be doctored, corrected, and perfumed according to the occasion, the diner's health, or simply the whim of the host. Some of these flavors are delightful rediscoveries, while others remain fascinating, if utterly unpalatable, relics of a world with a very different definition of a good drink. That dark, sweet syrup we created holds the key to one of history's most persistent and tragic mysteries. We must directly confront the elephant in the room, the presence of lead in the Roman world. The historical evidence is overwhelming and chilling. Writers like Columella and Pliny the Elder explicitly recommend using lead pots, or pots with lead solder, for boiling grape mussed down into defrutum and sapa. The reason was simple chemistry and tragic ignorance. When the acidic grape juice was boiled in these lead vessels, it dissolved a compound called lead acetate, which we now know as sugar of lead. This substance is deceptively, dangerously sweet, far sweeter than regular sugar, and it would have made the reduced syrup taste even more potent and appealing. For a Roman winemaker, this was a perfect result, a sweeter preservative that also gave their wine a desirable heavy body. They had no way of knowing they were creating a slow-acting poison. The science of lead poisoning is grimly straightforward. Lead is a neurotox, and that the human body mistakes for calcium. It gets incorporated into bones and tissues, and it wreaks havoc on the nervous system. The symptoms of chronic lead exposure read like a description of the ailments that plagued the Roman elite: severe abdominal pain, debilitating gout, memory loss, irritability, and infertility. The very aristocracy that could afford the finest, most heavily sweetened wines were systematically poisoning themselves with every glass. It is a heartbreaking paradox. Their pursuit of culinary perfection was actively undermining their health. For our practical tests, this presented an ethical line we would not cross. To understand the intended flavor effect of sapa without the lethal side effects, we used only safe, modern alternatives. The syrup we actually tasted was boiled in a stainless steel pot, allowing us to experience the rich, caramelized, fig-like sweetness and the textural weight it gave the wine, completely free from any toxic contamination. We could appreciate the Roman palate's desire for that profound sweetness and stability, while leaving the poison of the past firmly where it belongs, in the history books. This separation is crucial. It allows us to respectfully recreate their intended flavors while acknowledging the devastating cost of their technological ignorance. The final flavor of a Roman wine was not born in the vineyard or the vat, but in the quiet darkness of the cellar. Time itself was their last and most patient ingredient. The Romans drew a clear distinction between vinum novum, the rough and boisterous new wine, and vinum vetus, the old wine prized for its smoothness and complexity. We recreated the ideal Roman aging environment, a cella venaria, by storing our amphorae in a cool, dark, and humid space, its air still and its temperature constant. This was not passive storage. It was an active, slow-motion transformation. Our first tasting, after just 3 months, revealed a wine still in its youth. The vinum novum was vibrant and fruity, but it carried a sharp, aggressive edge, its tannins feeling rough and grippy on the palate. It was full of potential, but not yet a pleasure to drink. At the 6-month mark, a profound shift had begun. The wine's color had softened from a deep purple to a more gentle ruby. That harsh, astringent bite had receded, replaced by a smoother, rounder texture. The simple fruit notes started to deepen, evolving into hints of dried cherry and a subtle, emerging earthiness. The wine was settling into itself, finding its balance. The true revelation came after a full year of patient waiting. The Vinum Vetus was a different beverage entirely. Its aroma was complex and layered, with whispers of leather, dried figs, and roasted nuts. The once aggressive tannins had polymerized, linking together to create a structure that felt silky and integrated, not harsh. The flavor lingered on the tongue with a graceful, savory finish. This was the character the Roman elite celebrated, the legendary quality of a wine like Falernian, which could be aged for decades. They understood that only time could tame the wild spirit of the new wine, transforming raw power into a profound and lasting elegance. This patient alchemy in the cellar was the final, essential step in a journey that turned simple grape juice into a liquid legend. Our final test of Roman ingenuity hinges on the silent guardian of the vintage, the amphora. This iconic clay jar was far more than a simple container. It was a complete preservation system, and we needed to build one from the ground up. We began with a new, unglazed terracotta amphora, its porous walls ready to interact with the wine inside. The first critical step was lining its interior with pitch, the same pine resin we had tasted earlier. For our safe, drinkable version, we used a food-grade pine resin, carefully heating it to a liquid state and swirling it inside the warm amphora until a thin, continuous layer coated the entire inner surface. The smell was intensely medicinal, a sharp, cleansing aroma of pine forests. This resin lining served a dual purpose. It sealed the porous clay to prevent excessive seepage, and it imparted its own distinct flavor signature to the wine, a character the Romans would have expected and perhaps even desired. Once the pitch had cooled and hardened, we filled the amphora with our finished, blended wine. The final act of sealing was a ritual in itself. We placed a simple wooden stopper into the jar's mouth, then covered it completely with a thick cap of wet clay, effectively creating an airtight seal as the clay dried and hardened. Our control was the same wine, sealed in a sterile, neutral glass bottle. We placed both vessels back into our cool, dark cellar to age, and then we began the long watch, checking them monthly for any signs of change. The first thing we monitored was weight. A porous clay jar, even with a resin lining, will inevitably lose some liquid to evaporation through its walls, a process the Romans called the angel's share. Our modern glass bottle, of course, lost nothing. After several months, we could feel the difference. The amphora was noticeably lighter. This was a calculated loss for the Romans, a trade-off for the micro-oxygenation that helped mature the wine. When we finally broke the clay seal and opened the amphora after a full year, the transformation was profound. The wine from the glass bottle was fine, a clean and fruity preservation of what we had put in. But the amphora wine was something else entirely. It had developed a subtle, smoky, ricinated character, a direct contribution from the pine pitch lining. The pitch had also done its job. The wine showed only a slight concentration of flavors from evaporation, but no spoilage. It was a richer, more complex, and decidedly ancient-tasting beverage. The amphora was not just a storage jar. It was the final, active ingredient, a terracotta lung that breathed with the wine, concentrating its soul and stamping it with the unmistakable flavor of Rome itself. The clarity of a wine was as important as its flavor to a Roman connoisseur. They despised a cloudy, hazy appearance, viewing it as a sign of poor craftsmanship or a wine that was still wild and unsettled. We took several jars of our young, sediment-laden wine and prepared to clarify them using the ancient tools of the trade. Our first method was one that would be familiar to any modern winemaker: egg whites. We gently separated the whites from 3 eggs, whisking them just enough to break them up before stirring them into the cloudy wine. The science here is elegant. As the egg whites slowly sink through the liquid, their positive electrical charge acts like a magnet, attracting the negatively charged particles of yeast and other tiny solids that cause the haze. Within hours, we saw a thick, grayish layer of sludge forming at the bottom of the jar, and the wine above it was becoming miraculously clear. We then tested a method using milk. Adding a small amount of fresh milk to another batch created a similar, though slower, reaction. The casein proteins in the milk curdle in the presence of the wine's alcohol and acidity, and these curds then drag the impurities down as they fall. But then we moved into truly ancient territory, using a substance called creta. This was a fine white powder, a combination of clay and marble dust that Roman writers recommended for correcting a wine that had gone sour. We stirred a small amount into a third jar. The powder clouded the wine even more at first, but over the next day, it settled into an incredibly dense, compact layer at the bottom, leaving a surprisingly bright wine above it. The physical results were clear, but the real question was one of taste. Did these clarifying agents leave a ghost of their own flavor behind? We carefully racked or siphoned the clear wine from each batch, leaving the sediment behind. Tasting them side by side revealed subtle but distinct differences. The egg white fined wine was pristine, its fruit character pure and unaltered. The milk-treated wine had a slightly rounder, softer mouthfeel, as if the proteins had smoothed out some of the wine's rougher edges. The wine treated with creta, however, had a faint, stony minerality on the finish, a whisper of the earth that had just fallen out of it. For the Romans, this was not just about aesthetics, it was about control. By choosing their fining agent, they could not only achieve visual brilliance, but also gently steer the final taste of their wine, polishing its texture or adding a final, subtle note of terroir drawn directly from the ground beneath their feet. The crystal clarity of our finished wine presented a final, surprising question. Why would anyone deliberately dilute such a carefully crafted beverage? For the Romans, drinking wine straight was considered the mark of a barbarian, a practice as uncivilized as drinking undiluted vinegar. We prepared to test this cornerstone of their drinking culture by setting up a formal tasting with 3 distinct ratios. The first was a mix of 1 part wine to 1 part water, a strong brew recommended for a hearty winter feast. The second was a more common 3 parts water to 1 part wine, the standard table dilution. The third was a very weak 1 part wine to 5 parts water, a hydrating drink for laborers or children. Tasting them in sequence was a lesson in ancient moderation. The 1-to-1 mixture was still intensely flavorful, its herbal and smoky notes bold and pronounced, but the water had already tamed the alcohol's heat, making it smoother and much easier to drink in large quantities. The 3-to-1 dilution was a revelation. This was not a weakened drink, but a transformed one. The water acted as a solvent, pulling forward subtle floral and mineral aromas that were completely masked in the neat wine. The harsh edges of tannin and acidity softened into a refreshing, almost thirst-quenching beverage. It was incredibly sessionable, something you could sip all afternoon during a long symposium without becoming incapacitated. The 5-to-1 ratio was indeed very mild. A faintly tinted, slightly flavored water that would have been a safe, hydrating option in a world where plain water could often be unsafe to drink. The practical reasons for this custom become overwhelmingly clear. Dilution was a brilliant social and economic tool. It stretched a valuable commodity, allowing a single amphora to serve an entire household for days. More importantly, it was a built-in system of temperance. A Roman symposium could last for many hours, with philosophical debate flowing as freely as the wine. Drinking it diluted meant participants could remain clear-headed and engaged, enjoying the convivial atmosphere without the rapid descent into drunkenness. The taste test proved that their goal was not to ruin a good wine, but to engineer a perfect social lubricant, a drink that enhanced conversation and community without overwhelming the senses or the intellect. The true taste of Rome was not found in a strong, undiluted spirit, but in this balanced, communal cup, a testament to a culture that valued clarity of mind as much as complexity of flavor. Our finished wine now faced its ultimate trial, a Roman dinner party known as a convivium. We gathered our modern guests not in a sterile tasting room, but around a low couch, recreating the relaxed, reclining posture that defined these ancient gatherings. The first symbolic act was the election of the rex bibendi, the king of the feast. Our chosen rex was handed a small, ceremonial cup and given the first duty of the evening, to propose the initial toast to the gods and to mix the wine with water according to his own judgment. He carefully poured a measure of our rich, sapa-sweetened wine into a large crater, then added 3 parts of cool water, stirring the mixture with a long ladle. This was not just a practical step. It was a ritual that established the communal nature of the drink, a shared beverage whose strength was literally in the hands of a temporary leader. As the diluted wine was served, we presented the first authentic Roman foods. A fresh, crusty loaf of spelt bread was broken and passed around. Guests dipped pieces into a small bowl of garum, the fermented fish sauce that was the Roman equivalent of ketchup. The initial taste was a bold, savory, and intensely umami explosion, a far cry from the subtle flavors of modern cuisine. Then came the moment of truth, the first sip of wine alongside the food. The reaction around the couch was one of genuine surprise. The sweet, heavy, and slightly oxidized character of our Roman wine performed a miraculous balancing act with the salty, pungent garum. The wine's sweetness cut through the fish sauce's intensity, while its robust body stood up to the powerful flavor without being overwhelmed. It was a pairing that made perfect sense, a culinary harmony that our modern palates would never have predicted. As the feast progressed with dishes of lentils, cheese, and olives, the role of the wine evolved. The more diluted, herb-infused wines we had created acted as a refreshing palate cleanser between bites, their subtle thyme and rose notes complementing the simpler fare. The conversation flowed as freely as the wine, and we observed the social dynamics the Romans cherished. The rex bibendi guided the toasts. The topics of discussion shifted from philosophy to daily life, and the act of reclining and sharing from a common crater fostered a tangible sense of equality and connection among the guests. The feedback from our modern participants was the final piece of the puzzle. They unanimously agreed that the wines, which might have seemed strange or challenging on their own, became entirely different beverages in the context of the food and the social ritual. The sweetness was no longer cloying but functional. The herbal notes felt intentional and refreshing, and the lower alcohol content from dilution allowed for hours of comfortable, clear-headed conversation. This was the true purpose of Roman wine. It was not a solitary indulgence, but the vital, social heart of the convivium, an engineered beverage designed to unite food, friends, and philosophy in a single shared cup. The flavor of Rome was not just in the grape or the amphora. It was in the laughter and debate that flowed around that crater, a taste of community we had finally managed to recreate. The moment of truth had finally arrived. We gathered our panel of tasters, their palates accustomed to the clean, fruit-forward wines of today, and prepared a blind tasting that would bridge 2 millennia. On the tables sat our finest recreation, a wine born from sun-drenched slopes, foot-trodden grapes, and a year of quiet aging in a pitched amphora. Its competitors were carefully chosen modern Italian whites, a Greco di Tufo and a Fiano, selected for their shared heritage and similar grape profiles. Each wine was poured into identical opaque glasses, their identities hidden behind a simple number. The first test was visual. Tasters noted the modern wine's bright straw yellow hues, their clarity a hallmark of contemporary filtration. Our Roman wine, however, presented a deeper gold amber color, a visual signature of its oxidative aging in porous clay. It was the first silent clue to its ancient origins. Then came the nose. The Greco di Tufo offered a burst of crisp citrus and white flowers, while the Fiano was richer with notes of honey and pear. When they lifted the glass containing our Roman vintage, their reactions were palpable. The familiar fruit was there, but it was layered with something entirely different. They detected whispers of dried apricot, a distinct nuttiness like toasted almond, and a subtle, savory hint of dried thyme from our deliberate infusion. This was not a simple fruit bomb, it was a complex aromatic tapestry. The true division came on the palate. The modern wines were vibrant and acidic, clean and direct, with a finish that was refreshing but relatively short. Our Roman wine landed on the tongue with an entirely different weight and texture. Its sweetness, derived from our safe sapa syrup, gave it a round, almost unctuous body that coated the mouth. The tannins, though softened by time, provided a subtle structural grip that neither modern white possessed. The finish was the real revelation. It lingered with flavors of dried fig, a touch of honeyed walnut, and that persistent, intriguing herbal note. One taster described it as drinking history itself, a flavor that was less about immediate refreshment and more about contemplative complexity. The modern wines were praised for their precision and drinkability, but our Roman recreation was consistently noted for its unique, layered character, a beverage that demanded another sip to unravel all its secrets. This side-by-side comparison proved that the Roman palate was not inferior, just distinct. They engineered their wines for body, stability, and aromatic intrigue, creating a drink that was meant to be experienced slowly, a companion for food and philosophy rather than a simple thirst quencher. The evolution of winemaking has given us brilliance and purity, but it may have also cost us a certain kind of depth, a textural weight and oxidative complexity that once defined an entire civilization's idea of a fine drink. Our sensory journey through taste and aroma now meets the unblinking eye of modern science. We carefully packaged samples of our most significant recreations, from the wild fermented dolium wine to the sapa-sweetened blend, and sent them to an analytical laboratory. This was our reality check, a way to move beyond our subjective impressions and see the hard data behind the flavors. The report that came back gave us a complete chemical portrait of what we had truly made. First, the alcohol content. Our wines measured between 9 and 10%, a far cry from the 14 or 15% common in many modern bottles. This lower level was a direct result of the native yeasts and the cooler, slower fermentation in the buried dolium, a testament to the Roman preference for a less potent, more sessionable drink. Then we looked at the pH and acidity. The numbers revealed a wine with a surprisingly bright, high acidity. a natural preservative that would have helped it resist spoilage during long storage. This was the hidden strength behind their aging potential. The most telling data, however, came from the analysis for fault compounds. We scanned the results for acetic acid, the primary component of vinegar, and held our breath. Any detectable amount would signal the beginning of a spoilage that could ruin an entire amphora. Our wines showed only trace levels, a triumph of our careful sanitation and the protective qualities of the sapa syrup. But then we saw it, a small but distinct presence of ethyl acetate. This compound, which smells like nail polish remover, can be a flaw in high concentrations. In our wine, it was just enough to contribute a faint, sharp, almost fruity note in the background, a subtle complexity that might have been a familiar part of the ancient aromatic landscape. The science confirmed that we had not created vinegar, but a stable, intentionally different kind of beverage. It was a wine built for endurance, with lower alcohol, bracing acidity, and a chemical signature that walked a fascinating line between fault and character. This objective data proved that the Roman palate was not just a matter of taste, but a sophisticated understanding of wine as a stable, living substance. While our recreated wine was designed for the elite, the true lifeblood of the Roman army flowed from a far humbler vessel. Posca was the soldier's staple, a sharp, vinegary drink made from sour wine mixed with water and whatever herbs were at hand. We decided to mix a batch according to the most basic recipe, starting with a wine we had deliberately allowed to turn. The aroma was unmistakably acetic, a pungent, eye-watering wave of vinegar that filled the air. We diluted this harsh liquid with 3 parts of water, then crushed in a generous handful of fresh thyme and a few peppercorns. The first cautious sip was a shocking, bracing experience. It is intensely sour, without any of the rounded sweetness of our other recreations. The thyme adds a gritty, savory note, and the peppercorns contribute a surprising warmth at the back of the throat. To a modern palate accustomed to soft drinks and clean water, it is almost undrinkable. But for a Roman legionary on a long, dusty march, this sharpness was the entire point. The acidity of the vinegar would have acted as a primitive antiseptic, helping to kill some of the harmful bacteria present in the questionable water sources they encountered across the empire. More importantly, the powerful flavor of the posca itself completely masked the taste of stagnant or brackish water, making it palatable and encouraging hydration in an age when dehydration could decimate an army faster than any enemy. This was not a drink for pleasure, it was a tool for survival. The sharp tang that makes us wince was the very thing that kept legions healthy and moving, a daily dose of practical chemistry in a clay canteen. Our single amphora required over 200 pounds of hand-harvested grapes, a week of fermentation, and a full year of patient aging. Scaling this up reveals the immense economic engine behind Roman wine. A modest vineyard of just 10 acres could yield enough fruit for over 1,000 amphorae each season, a volume demanding a small army of laborers. The choice between slave and hired work was a constant calculation for a vineyard owner. A slave was a significant upfront investment, perhaps the equivalent of 2 denarii, but they provided a lifetime of labor. A hired free worker, a mercenarius, cost only a few denarii per day, but that expense was perpetual. For a large, established estate, slavery was the bedrock of production, ensuring a stable, controllable workforce for the relentless, year-round cycle of pruning, harvesting, and pressing. Yet during the frantic harvest, even the largest estates had to hire temporary workers, paying a premium for speed to capture the grapes at their perfect moment of ripeness. This labor was the single greatest cost, transforming sunlight and soil into a valuable commodity. Once filled, our amphora's journey was just beginning. Transporting it by ox cart to a port added significantly to its final price, a cost that could double if the wine was destined for a legion on the distant German frontier. This is where the value of a legendary wine like Fermenting becomes clear. Our recreation was a good, solid vintage, the kind that might sell for 20 or 30 denarii in a Pompeii tavern. But a single amphora of aged Fermenting could command 4 times that price or more. Its fame was its own currency, a guarantee of quality that justified the exorbitant cost of shipping it across the Mediterranean to the richest patrons in Rome. Our experiment was not just about flavor, it was about value. Every drop represented an investment of sweat, time, and silver, a tangible link in the supply chain that fueled commerce from a Campanian hillside to a merchant's shop in Londinium. The path to a perfect Roman vintage was littered with far more failures than successes. For every amphora of legendary Fermenting, countless others soured into vinegar or developed bizarre, undrinkable flaws. Our own experiments were no exception, and the batches that went wrong taught us just as much as the ones that succeeded. We watched in dismay as one carefully prepared jar developed a thick, leathery film on its surface, a living raft of yeast known as flor in modern sherry production, but a terrifying sight to an ancient vintner who would have seen it as a sure sign of spoilage. Another batch, intended to be a simple wild fermentation, never quite took off, languishing for weeks before developing the unmistakable, sharp sting of acetic acid, transforming our precious wine into common vinegar. The most memorable failure, however, was a sensory nightmare. A wine we had infused with a particular combination of herbs developed a foul, rotten egg aroma, the result of sulfur-producing bacteria thriving in an oxygen-free environment. One cautious sip revealed a flavor of garlic and burnt rubber, a completely ruined beverage that had to be discarded immediately. Historical accounts are filled with descriptions of these exact faults. The Roman writer Horace complains of wine that tastes of the pitch used to seal the amphora, a flaw we encountered when our resin lining was applied too thickly. Others describe wines turning sour or ropey, their texture becoming unnaturally thick and slimy. Without the understanding of microbiology we have today, the Roman winemaker was essentially a gardener tending to an invisible, unpredictable ecosystem. Their only tools were observation, tradition, and a great deal of hope. They knew that wine stored near a kitchen fire was more likely to spoil, though they would not have understood that heat accelerated bacterial activity. They understood that a tightly sealed amphora was safer, without knowing it was limiting the oxygen that spoilage organisms need. Each successful batch was a minor miracle, a testament to the fragile equilibrium between sugar, acid, alcohol, and the unseen world of microbes. The skill was in creating an environment where the desirable yeast could win its microscopic war. And the luck was in everything else, from the temperature of the cellar to the integrity of a single clay seal. This constant, looming threat of loss makes their achievements all the more impressive, and it forces us to appreciate every stable amphora not just as a drink, but as a hard-won victory against the invisible forces of decay. That deep amber wine we tasted is not simply a relic, it is a living ancestor. The Roman approach to winemaking did not vanish with the empire, it simply evolved, its fingerprints left all over the vineyards of modern Europe. Look at the great wine regions the Romans established. the very foundations of today's appellations. When they marched into Gaul, they brought vines with them, planting the first vineyards in what would become Burgundy and Bordeaux. In Hispania, they developed a thriving export industry, with Spanish wines traveling by amphora to every corner of the empire. And of course, in Italy itself, the heartland of Roman viticulture never stopped beating, with ancient grape lineages like the Aglianico of the south, whose name is a direct linguistic descendant of the Latin Vitis Hellenica, the Greek vine. The very map of the European wine world was drawn by Roman legions and merchants. Many of the techniques we tested have also endured in a direct, unbroken line. That terracotta dolium we buried in the ground never truly went away. In Italy, these large clay jars are called gyre or orsai, and a new generation of visionary winemakers is rediscovering their magic, using them for a pure, unadulterated expression of the grape. When you drink a modern wine aged in terracotta, you are experiencing the same gentle micro-oxygenation and textural softening that a Roman connoisseur would have prized. The practice of appassimento, drying grapes to concentrate their sugars, which we mimicked with our Sopper reduction, is the same method used today for prestigious wines like Amarone. Even the Roman habit of infusing wine with herbs and spices echoes in modern aromatized wines like vermouth. This was not a lost art, but a dispersed and adapted technology. The Roman Empire acted as the world's most effective viticultural missionary, taking the vine and the knowledge of how to transform it, and grafting it onto cultures from the Danube to the Atlantic. They provided the rootstock, and 2,000 years of history provided the scion, creating the incredible diversity of wines we enjoy today. Every time you uncork a bottle from these ancient regions, you are tasting the lingering echo of Rome's liquid legacy. After a year of sun, sweat, and science, we can finally answer the question that started this journey. Our final Roman wine was a complex, amber-colored beverage, surprisingly delicious in its own ancient way. The most successful techniques were often the simplest. Foot treading produced a beautifully delicate juice, and aging in the buried dolium gave the wine a smooth, nutty complexity that felt both old and sophisticated. The addition of sapa syrup created a rich, fig-like sweetness and a heavy body that was perfectly suited to cutting through the strong flavors of Roman food. Yet some aspects were a genuine challenge to our modern palates. The pine resin from the amphora lining left a sharp, medicinal note we never fully embraced, and the seawater wine remained a briny, acquired taste we would not care to acquire. The overall character of our vintage was one of deliberate engineering, not pure fruit expression. It was a sweet, oxidized, and herb-infused drink, built for stability and social ritual rather than for solitary sipping. This entire project reveals the sheer ingenuity of the Roman vintner. Without understanding microbiology, they used porous clay and careful blending to create stable wines that could last for years. Without modern chemistry, they harnessed natural preservatives like sapa and salt. They were masterful technicians of their craft, even as their use of lead casts a tragic shadow over their achievements. The enduring mystery is not whether they could make good wine, but why they preferred this specific, powerful flavor profile, a taste that feels so foreign to us now. We have pulled one thread from the vast tapestry of the ancient world, but there are so many more mysteries waiting to be tested. What should we investigate next? Should we bake bread in a replica legionary oven, forge a sword with Celtic techniques, or perhaps recreate the perfumes of Cleopatra? The past is a laboratory, and your curiosity is the key. Tell us what historical puzzle you want us to solve in the comments below. and subscribe to join us on our next adventure into the unknown.